Hello, this is Hollisa Alewine, and welcome back to our continuing study on the resurrection. And we're working out of the book, 50,000 Degrees and Cloudy, A Better Resurrection. And now we're in section 2. We've established the Torah foundation for the resurrection, and now we're into territory that's not so well defined as the Torah itself, because we're taking passages that are basically considered resurrection passages, and we're also looking at Jewish tradition, because even the doctrine of resurrection itself comes from the Jewish tradition. All by ourselves, if somebody gave us the first 5 books of the Bible and we had never heard of anything and said, what do you get out of that? Most of us wouldn't come up with resurrection. But obviously, in the Jewish tradition, that's where they're deriving this doctrine. So in this section of the book, we're looking into Jewish tradition and finding places where it merges or crosses over with some of the things that we're reading in the Brit Chadashah. And in a previous program, we looked extensively at a passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, where it describes how Miriam goes to the garden tomb and she has this experience with 2 angels, or another gospel says a young man. She has an experience with someone she thinks is a gardener, and then we find out this is Yeshua, but she does this remarkable turning that makes it appear as though she's talking to 2 different people. So we're not sure exactly who she saw, but we can figure out who she thought she saw, because we looked at the Jewish tradition concerning what you see when you do go into the Garden of Eden after death. So we tied that back to not just Eve's weeping when she was kicked out of the garden with Adam, but we also tied it back to Sarah weeping at the cave of Machpelah at Hebron, where she's interceding for that greater resurrection. And so as Miriam goes into this garden environment, we see that she also appears to be weeping to such an extent that both the angels and Yeshua ask her, Isha, why are you weeping? And we could even think, well, Abraham, when he's going to Mount Moriah to sacrifice Isaac, he also takes 2 young men with him. And then he leaves them behind, and he and Isaac go on to the mountain. And so we wonder, what were those 2 young men doing? We see 2 young men in the tomb that we know are angels. So who are the young men going with Abraham? It doesn't really say. It's kind of mysterious. And so we could even see that correlation between Eve, or Chava, and Sarah weeping at a tomb, because this is the tomb of Abraham and Sarah is also thought to be the tomb of Adam and Eve. We can see 2 women in history that would have also been weeping around a garden tomb. And then Miriam sees these 2 Ishim. She sees these 2 angels. And at that point, she realizes there's no corpse in the tomb, but she's not quite getting that Yeshua is resurrected. She thinks the body has just been moved. So she speaks to the gardener. And we know the first gardener, the one who was supposed to guard and keep the garden, Adam. Well, now in this garden tomb area, she thinks she sees a gardener. And we're not sure who it is. We get the message that this was actually Yeshua. But in the tradition, this would have been the first Adam that she meets in this tomb, because in the tradition, that's the first person you meet when you cross into the garden. The first Adam has to meet you, and he has to greet you with great joy, which would account for his question, Isha, why are you weeping? You're back in the garden. This is good news, not bad news. Nobody's dead here. But we see that hope in Miriam's return, whereas the disciples are remaining behind. hiding, basically. It's Miriam, it's the women who go to the tomb. And, this might account for, it's always women who receive back their dead in Scripture. But we see here that this first gardener, if it is Adam, or if it just represents the first Adam, then we can see how he has been awakened into this resurrected state. Perhaps one of those holy ones seen walking around Jerusalem or seen walking around the holy city when Yeshua resurrected. But we see there in Miriam, we see that hope, I believe, of Sarah, and we see that hope of Eve, Chava, being buried in that particular place that's seen as the entrance back to the garden. So it could be that where Miriam is a much deeper experience than just simply encountering an empty tomb and having a short conversation with Yeshua. She may have actually been allowed to step into the lower garden. Because remember, there is a matter of going up associated with going into the garden. But in all the scriptures and hints that we looked at, we could see, well, it's not that high. It's more a matter of seeing into than something snatching you into outer space. It's something that can open up to your spiritual vision. So it appears her vision, she's seeing things that maybe she wouldn't have seen so much in the physical realm. Her first reaction, once she realizes this is not a gardener, that this is actually Yeshua, she says something that's significant, because in the Jewish tradition, the lower garden, the Garden of Eden, once you die, it's a place where you would go and you would learn the Torah. It would be a place of learning and preparation while you await the resurrection of your body. And it's also a place, once that body's assembled, then it could be presented to the Father, that body could ascend up into this upper garden, much closer to the presence than this more preparatory place where basically you're kind of half in heaven and half in earth, because that was the way that the first human beings were made, to be able to move freely between those realms. And that's what's unique about a human being. That was our specific design. Because an angel, it can have a physical appearance and can do some physical things, but it's not designed. It's not specifically designed to operate in our realm the way that we are. So Miriam says, Rabboni. She quits calling him sir or Adon, and now she calls him a Rabboni, which is my teacher. She's not calling him master, the term she's used with the angels, with the Ishim, or the term that she even used with this first Yeshua before she turns the other way. Now she says Rabboni when Yeshua calls her name, Miriam. And that's interesting because, remember, Eve was Isha before sin, and then Adam gives her the name Chava, the mother of all living. But when Yeshua calls her Isha, woman, we might think of it as, well, it's a little derogatory, like woman. But, Yeshua didn't live down south. He lived in first century Israel, Judea, and the Galilee. So when he calls a woman, it's not necessarily a negative connotation there. He's using Eve's original name, Isha. And that recognition of restoration, like, Miriam, don't you realize what I've just done has restored you? It's opened access for you back into the garden. Come on in. Isha, why are you weeping? This is a place to be happy. Like I said, you're not really seeing dead people here. Dead people are alive, and they're awaiting the resurrection of their bodies. And so this lower garden, again, is associated with a realm of learning and preparation. You're going to learn pretty much the holiness and the purities that are required in order to ascend into the holy presence. And there's a significant scripture that helps us understand why she would call him Rabboni, my teacher. Isaiah 30, verses 19 and 20 says, O people in Zion, inhabitant in Jerusalem, you will weep no longer. He will surely be gracious to you at the sound of your cry. When he hears it, he will answer you. Although the Lord has given you bread of privation and water of oppression, he, your teacher, will no longer hide himself, but your eyes will behold your teacher. That's a beautiful prophecy in Isaiah. Is this what Miriam had in mind when she said Rabboni? She realizes that this passage of prophecy has been fulfilled in Yeshua, my teacher. My eyes have beheld my teacher. He wasn't just her teacher in physical life. He would continue to be her teacher in the garden. Because in this lower garden, according, again, to Jewish tradition, is where the palace of Messiah is. So if we look at what the Jewish sage Rashi says about this specific passage, where it says, your eyes will behold your teacher, he actually links it to a passage in the Torah, Numbers 23:23. And that passage says, at the proper time, it shall be said to Jacob and to Israel, what miracle God has done. What miracle. All right, now, in context, remember, context is everything. It's part of the story of Bilam and his vision of Israel. Remember, he had been hired to curse Israel and he couldn't do it. But he is a reluctant prophet. But that miraculous event that's going to occur has its context in Numbers 23:21. It says, he has not observed misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and this is the significant part, and the shout of a king is among them. So what takes away misfortune from Jacob? What takes away tribulation from Israel? When it says the Lord his God is with him, which is what Paul tells us will happen at the resurrection, that we will dwell with him forever. The Lord his God is with him, and it says the shout of a king is among them. That is very specifically, we know by now, resurrection, Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets language. And so linking, your eyes shall behold your teacher, what Miriam is receiving at Passover, at the Feast of First Fruits, at this particular time, is a glimpse, again, into the fall feast. She's seeing a resurrection from the dead here, right, on a third day, but the language in the Torah and the prophets, according to the Jewish tradition, is specifically tied to the symbols of Rosh Hashanah, the resurrection of the dead on the fifth day, the Feast of Trumpets. Why? Because the shout of a king, the shout, the loud voice, and then of course we know that the throne, the king, royalty, ruling over the nations, that's all part of the Feast of Trumpets. Especially in the Jewish liturgy, it's full of those sorts of references. So this play on word here with the shout in Hebrew, it's actually the sound of a shofar. It's teruah, with the shout, with the teruah of the king. We associate that very specifically with the Feast of Trumpets and the first resurrection. So we can see there chiastically with the third and the fifth days that Miriam's experience, what comes out of her mouth, is not just something associated with what she's just seen in terms of the resurrection of Yeshua. it's actually driving forward into a greater resurrection of the body of Messiah at the Feast of Trumpets. This great miracle that's going to take place, that Rashi is talking about in his commentaries. He says there's going to be a great miracle that's going to be seen. And it's going to be with the shout of a king. And that gives us our context exactly. It couldn't be any more spot on right there. So what we see in Bilam, where he says, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. The dwelling places are not just the physical dwelling places that Bilam is seeing. He's talking about Israel forever being with the Lord, forever being in Sukkot of glory, forever being gathered into the cloud with the Messiah, with the shout of the King, Israel being revealed to all nations, Israel sitting before him and learning Torah from his mouth. Your eyes shall behold your teacher. So it makes sense why Miriam would shift if she's having this sort of experience in the garden and call Yeshua Rabboni, because now we have context with two resurrection days, not just the immediate one and Yeshua, but the one that she expects when he gives the shout of the King at Rosh Hashanah. So it's significant that in the garden, Yeshua tells Miriam to quit clinging to him because he must ascend to the Father. And you say, well, what is he talking about? Isn't he already ascended if he's in the lower garden? And the answer there would be yes. He has ascended to that point. But remember, in those passages we read about the rivers of Eden and how the river ran out of Eden and then watered the whole garden. So you can't, that doesn't make sense unless you recognize that this lower garden was actually a mirror of the upper garden, and its source was the upper garden. The river coming from beneath the throne of the upper garden was what came down and watered the lower garden. And in Jewish tradition, this is what takes place at the resurrection, that you would first ascend into the lower garden. There would be a time of preparation, which we don't think Yeshua needs, by the way, especially if he's in his own palace, if that's where Messiah's palace is located. And from there, he needs to go into the upper garden. Now, there's probably a dozen different explanations we could have for why he doesn't want her to touch him at that particular moment. Probably the easiest reason would be that until he completes that journey, he doesn't want to be touched by something that would be ritually impure. And she is also a physical being. At this point, she's fully human and also fully in that fallen state. In the physical part of the garden, so she's standing where there's corpses. She's probably walked over corpses. That might be why the disciples didn't go to begin with. They didn't want to be ritually impure during the week of Pesach, so they weren't ready to go check the tomb quite yet. They left that to the ladies. We don't know exactly why, but we know that from what Yeshua says, he feels like he has to complete this second ascension into the upper garden before he allows human beings to touch him, which is fine. He's the boss, right? He decides and we learn. He's the teacher and we're the students. But we see this pattern in the tabernacle or in the temple. There's degrees of holiness, and just about anybody can be on this outer perimeter. Even the lepers can be out there. Then you would have the camp of Israel, you would have the camp of the Levites, you would have the camps of the priests, and then you had the same principle in the tabernacle and the temple itself. This kind of a person could go this far, and then this kind of person could go this far, until finally it's so exclusive that there's only one human being on earth at a time who could actually go into the Holy of Holies. And so it tells you that there's degrees of holiness. It doesn't mean you're wicked or mean if you're out here. It just means that's where your realm is for that time. That's where you serve. But for the one who's going to go into the Holy of Holies, the requirements are so intense. You realize how many ways you can be killed if you're a high priest and you do something wrong? Or even if you're a priest and you do something wrong. You can't even grow wild hair if you're a priest and serve in the temple. You come into the temple with wild hair, you could be struck dead. They had high standards that they had to meet, especially the high priest on Yom Kippur. So we can see that spending this time in the lower garden makes perfect sense because it's a place of preparation. It's a process to go through. So when that final ascension occurs, and it looks like from the book of Revelation, the indication is that no one is going, except Yeshua, is going to ascend all the way to the presence of the Father until his entire bride or his entire body is assembled, and then they will be presented as one unified body. That's debatable, but remember we said in section 2, we're not really trying to set doctrine. We're just working through a lot of information to see if we can assemble a rough idea of what happens after death. So we know that, there's holy places and there's holier places and there's the holiest place. This experience that Miriam is having is obviously in a holy place, but it's obviously not as holy as the place where Yeshua needs to go to finish this process. We might say that at this point, wherever he's going, she can't continue with him at that point in time. And this is something, again, that's very important because it's going to connect the cave at Hebron, where the patriarchs and the matriarchs are buried. I almost said married. That would be funny, married and buried. They weren't married in Hebron, they were buried in Hebron, even though they were married. But the high priest, if he's going to enter this Holy of Holies each year at Yom Kippur, first he has to mikveh. In fact, he does it repeatedly. It's a pretty complicated process. Where does the water come from? On the Temple Mount in the Second Temple period for the priest to immerse. Well, it starts back at Hebron. A news article on this, on the archaeological excavation of this area, talks about an aqueduct from Hebron that was found, and it says the aqueduct begins at the Ein Etam spring near Solomon's Pools, south of Bethlehem. Now, the Ein Etam spring is on the outskirts of Hebron. And then it goes to Bethlehem. The aqueduct started there at Ein Etam, then it goes to Bethlehem. It stretches 21 kilometers, then to Jerusalem. And it says, despite its length, it flows along a very gentle downward slope whereby the water level falls just 1 meter per kilometer of distance. So, in more biblical terms, the waters of the spring were located 23 amot, which we would translate as cubits, higher than the floor of the temple. So it's just high enough, if the slope is gentle enough, that Hebron becomes the source spring for the Temple Mount. And we know it was there at least from the time of the Hasmoneans for the high priest to immerse in. It says, in the Mishnah, it says 5 immersions and 10 sanctifications. So he had to mikveh 5 times, in other words, for Yom Kippur. 10 sanctifications, the high priest immerses and sanctifies his hands and feet, respectively, on the day of Yom Kippur. And all of these immersions and sanctifications take place in the sacred area, the temple courtyard, in the hall of Parvah, Abai said, conclude, that Ein Etam, the spring from which the water was supplied to the temple, was 23 cubits higher than the ground of the temple courtyard. So why is that important? Well, we know that Yeshua's resurrection occurs in the week of Pesach, Passover. All 7 of our festivals, remember, we study them individually and we might celebrate them individually, but they're one cohesive unit. Each of these feasts is part of one unit, just like the 7 branches of the menorah are part of one unit. So they interlock, they overlap, and that gives them a unity. Each prescribed feast is going to prescribe something about the divine plan for salvation, redemption, return to the garden, and so forth. So as a type and a shadow for the people to see, this high priest is going to have to immerse before the Yom Kippur service. And where he's going to immerse is supplied by the water from Hebron. And again, it flowed through Bethlehem, Bethlehem first. This is the place of Yeshua's birth. And so it's almost like we have this map of the garden, this believed entrance at Hebron supplying the water, pointing to the birthplace of Messiah, and Bethlehem, pointing to the Temple Mount, where the high priest is going to immerse 5 times before he goes into the Holy of Holies. So from there, that's where he would go after he immersed in this water and make atonement for the sins of Israel once per year. So that's pretty significant to tie the entrance of the garden to Yom Kippur, where Israel would be seen not as individuals, but they would be forgiven as a nation, as a people. And that's what we see with Miriam. She sees Yeshua in a garden before he ascends to the Father in the upper garden. He has to rise to another level than the one she's seeing. And in the Jewish tradition, and there's some evidence for this also in the book of Revelation, it says that the souls of the righteous dead are located under the throne of Adonai. In other words, remember there's an upper garden, there's a lower garden just beneath it. That's why we look at the chiasms, right? If Adonai's throne is up here, it also says the earth is his footstool. All right, so here's his feet, I guess, on us. Or we're playing around his feet or something. Right, so where are the souls? According to the tradition, under the throne, which would place this lower garden, again, just under the throne, which would also explain why that river runs out from under the throne and waters the whole garden. So the souls of the righteous dead are located in this lower garden, awaiting the resurrection. And that's what he says. He says in Isaiah 66:1, he says, "Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where then is a house you can build for me? And where is a place that I may rest?" So before sin, we've got these natural and spiritual realms of the garden. They're one thing. And the Garden of Eden. Now they're separate things. The natural realm of earth, but then the garden is still just above it. There's still a spiritual realm that we don't see until we cross over. And that sign of faith, until we cross over, obviously has to do with the land, the covenant, the people of Israel, with our identity. If, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see returning to that cave of Machpelah as an indicator of our faith in the resurrection, that one day we too could ascend to beneath that throne, where we could literally play at his feet in that lower garden. And I believe this is the area where Yeshua and Miriam are having the conversation. From the scriptures, from the tradition, I think it makes sense.